Chapter 2, 9th day of January, 1679. I made it my habit on occasion to break bread with prisoners of the debtors' prison, so that I might appreciate something of what they must endure. The sparse meal was all they would have, but barely filled a space in their stomachs nor kept them warm. I would not eat more than each of them was given, as I sat with them a while and heard the latest prison news. On this bitter, bitter day in January that I would tell about, I left the room they called the castle and tightened my cloak against the cold, and outside met Maria Desimo and Mrs. Mary Airy, who came hither from other directions. Although we were glad enough of the company and greeted one another cordially, recent memory of the conditions inside removed any reason to smile. This group of good women I had established a year ago had the common aim of alleviating the suffering of prisoners in whatever way we could. "What is the debtors' lot? Fare they well?" asked Mrs. Airy. "Well enough, considering they are starved, frozen and filthy," I said. "They will die of cold before they die of dysentery, though their souls might die from lack of light ere that happens. How fared those you saw?" "Dire, Mother Celia. As with the debtors, they are so cold the rags they wear barely cover half their skin, and the other half is damp and exposed to icy stone that saps any warmth they might glean from meagre rations." "We must find more blankets for them." "I know a stable where some sit on the side unused." This came from a youngster with Mrs. Airy, who I knew to be barely out of the schoolroom. Her father had died in prison, and she now tried to improve the lot of others that were equally undeserving of their fate. "I could take maybe one or two, if they were still there tonight." "An excellent idea, miss." I took out my purse and gave her a couple of coins to cover the cost of the blankets. "But we will not become thieves no better than some inside these walls. Please offer this recompense to the owner." She wore no gloves, and her hands fumbled to clasp the coins as she put them into her drawstring purse. "Is there any other urgency?" I asked the women, noting their ruddy cheeks and noses. Prison work was hard on the stomach and hard on fair skin, but we never forgot we could leave that place at the end of the day, and we would warm our hands by a burning fire and eat hot broth before we slept. Those left lying on the cold stone floor, their own water soaking into the tattered remnants of their clothes, had less chance to see the morning each and every night they remained there, especially during the winter. Summer brought its own problems of stench and disease, but they were not the problems of now. The cold and lack of food were immediate and demanded our attention. "We will find whatever we can to cover them up and keep them warm. Will the turnkey let us give them?" Mrs. Airy rightly considered. "I know not the answer to that. They have been stricter lately, but we must try," I said. As the eldest, they often deferred to me as if I had every answer, and I allowed them to do so, since, more times than not, it allowed me my own way. The winter sun already sunk behind the buildings as we talked, and so we walked towards the gate lodge. "Might I ask if you are fully recovered, Mother Cellier? Our concern for you has been diligent." "I am most grateful for your concern. I am much recovered." I considered the pains I still suffered in my joints, particularly when the cold wind bit through the layers. My convalescence after the beating had been long and arduous, and even 9 months after the episode my chest continued to complain when I exerted myself too much. But worse was how jumpy I had become when I saw any huddle of persons in the street that looked as if it might have a purpose other than good. "Écoutez, qu'est-ce que c'est?" said Maria, stopping suddenly. She moved her head as if to locate an elusive sound, and frowned. "What is it?" asked Mrs. Airy. "Perhaps 'tis a dog." The young woman with Mrs. Airy held up her finger, signing for quiet. We listened to the silence so intently, when the sound came, it caused every one of us to jump with fright. "Hark! What noise is that?" Can it be an unnatural animal of the night? We listened some more. Our ears were assailed by sporadic sounds, horrible groaning, interspersed with terrible squealing and screeching that sent shivers through my scalp, skin, and into the base of my stomach, making me want to expel what little I recently ate. That was no animal, of that I was certain. It was a sound I would never forget. It was a sound that echoed a woman tortured 9 months since. Poor Mrs. Potter. It had the sound caused by the agony of body and searing of spirit that one man would inflict on another man or animal, the sound of a broken or breaking man. It comes from in there. The young girl pointed towards the condemned hole, or simply the hole as it was called, the dungeon where unspeakable acts took place, so they said. The sound came once more, and again brought to mind the midwife I had yet to find in this city that should be charged for murder if I did. Harris, the rough and toothless turnkey, stood near the entrance, looking the other way, his occasional flinch and the tightness of his features clearly demonstrating his failure to ignore the sound. "Harris," I asked, "what goes on in there?" Harris had worked there a long time, so I was surprised to see anything disconcert him. He could not hide his guilt, as he informed us. "'Tis old Mrs. Turner having a long labour." "If that is a woman on her birthing bed, then I am old Mother Hubbard. Are you ashamed to tell us the truth, Harris?" He knew I knew he lied. I looked at him closely until he looked away. "'Tis a woman in labour, I tell you." "In that case," I said, calling his bluff, "I am a midwife, and I will aid her with these good friends of mine." I started towards the source of the noise. "You cannot go in there." Harris had the decency to look to his feet as he spoke. "Harris, if there's a woman needing my skills, you had better let me past." Perhaps he foresaw himself as the next poor soul in the hole, and on the wrong side of the unspeakable axe, for he straightened and became sharp and scathing in his response. "What? What can you do, woman? You cannot do anything for that one. Go! Go back to your servant-filled homes and stop your pretense with the lives of villains." I did not waver. "If it is a man in there, Harris," I persisted, "what is he called?" There came a scream, like 100 wolves at night, redoubled by the inside of that cavernous entrance. Each of us stood silent and listened. I could barely breathe. That cry was of a man in more pain than any woman giving birth to a sideways child, worse than a man with his leg crushed beneath the iron wheel of a cart. The sound would stretch winter nights in the coming weeks longer than they could ever have been, a gentle torture in comparison, but one that would replay over and over into every silence. I took hold of the cross around my neck and gripped it tightly, praying for the fellow's soul and for the strength to save him. My fellow almsgivers also assumed a stance of resolve. Heads bent, we prayed together for his deliverance from pain. When we had done, we confronted the turnkey once more. "Let us down there, Harris," I said, confronting him face on. "We must stop this now." Harris had passed the moment by when he might be sympathetic to us, and came down on the other side. "Return to your business, papist whores. You are not welcome here. Begone with you." "Some of us be Catholic, but some of us are not," I said. "If we are or are not makes no difference to our charity, nor does it alter our resolve. Where is your compassion that you can stand by here and do nothing? That man is worse than dying." "Papist or papist lover, the one is bad as the other. Begone from here." Then, with a more urgent gesture, "Begone, I tell you." I sensed his imperative nature was not that his job required him to be sharp, but that the screams, enough to make any man weep, made him jittery. Indeed, the woman standing before him, tougher than many, cowered at each harrowing howl. The screams mingled with the screeches of some metal thing grating against metal, or perhaps stone, was enough to make all of us wish to run. I rarely took notice of Harris, a useless scab that spent half of his time looking into an empty ale mug and the other half engaged in achieving that view, sparing only obligatory pleasantries to keep it in with him. He was far from sweet-talking now. We were no longer gadflies biting his back, a nuisance to be swiped away, but witness to some heinous act outlawed and renounced in this country for more than 100 years. If he were discovered marking time with us, he might lose more than his job. His own and his family's life might depend on his ridding us from this gate. Later, when I thought about it, I knew how fear played the larger part in his next actions. I did not condone what he did, but I understood it. "Get thee gone from here, Mrs. Cellier. Take your woman and go." With which he took up the broadsword he had left lying in the shelter, an unnatural weapon for him despite his occupation, and swung the heavy iron round him like a madman. Then he raised it above his head and ran at us, screaming in a way we could not ignore. In horror, we also screamed and fled towards the gate, with him flailing the blade back and forth in the air behind us, more dangerous for his lack of authority over it. I do not know when he stopped chasing us, but we did not stop running until we had left the lodge behind us and escaped through the main entrance. There the four of us stood outside the gate with our backs against the rough stone wall of Turner's shop, heaving with exertion, the cold banished from our bodies by the effort. The bellowed air from our mouths hung suspended in a vapoured cloak before us. Even as I caught my breath, another scream chased after us. Other passers-by stopped to hear what sound that was, asking each other if they knew. Obviously puzzled, they waited a while to identify it when it came again, but being quieter here, most walked away shaking their heads unsatisfied, the mystery unsolved. It was not a sound anyone expected to hear, nor recognise, since it so often stayed behind closed doors, or in isolated houses in the countryside, as I remembered from my childhood. More than Mrs. Potter's dying screams, it conjured up every worst nightmare in me from my younger years. The large wooden entry door bursting open to admit Cromwell's men, their taking whatever they wanted in the way of possessions or the body, violently and without permission. I saw my mother held down by those men. Then there were cries and screams as well. Those attackers were the very ones to cause me to question both my own religion and the other. I could not deny I did not wish to be in league with such cruel devil beasts, and upon my soul, their very action against those of their own kind turned me to the religion they reviled, and put me into a religion that gave meaning to my life I would otherwise never have known. But terrible as those far distant memories, I could not recollect any night that I could match what noise came hence from the dark entrance of the hole. Not one of those horrors I imagined the poor wretch suffering could match the severity of those screams. Perhaps unimaginable horrors were always worse than imagined ones. Whatever that man experienced was the worst hell, and had no right to be found on this earth. Without warning, footsteps came fast towards us from the gate. Marie heard them too, because we both stood out from the wall together and stepped in the way of the runner. He was dressed in the garb of an officer of the prison. A ring of keys jangled rust against his fitted coat, mud clung to his tight breeches, and his cheap periwig was sent askew by such a fast pace that he would not have slowed down if the two of us had not stood in his way. Even then, he tried to pass through us as though we were insignificant in his need to escape. Mrs. Airy caught hold of his arm and said, "For crying out loud, what hounds chase you so fleet-foot from the prison?" Big-eyed, the officer looked at the hand on his arm, momentarily taken back that he was stopped, as if he had not seen us there. "What?" "I asked you, what are they doing in there?" Mrs. Airy said, emboldened. The officer looked back towards Harris guarding the door, shook his head and pulled his arm from Mrs. Airy's grasp. "I dare not tell you," I interjected. "'Tis a man upon the rack, I'll lay my life on it." Again the officer shook his head. "I know not, but I do know that if I stop here those demons will surely come for me." "Who is it? Is it the silversmith? Is it Prancer?" I asked. I heard there was some none too happy with the goldsmith of Covent Garden. A short time since he took the part with Titus Oates as a witness to the murder of the anti-Catholic knight, Sir Edmund Bury Godfrey, that London was in such a buzz about. They said the murder was under instruction of some Catholic priests. Having first denied any involvement, Prance then turned about to confess his part of the murder, only to recant it all once again before the king, proclaiming the innocence of himself and those he had named. It was to be supposed it was one thing to lie before the council, and another to perjure yourself before his majesty. They said the king promised him a pardon to allay his fears for what was to become of him if he spoke the truth. Word in the prison was that the lives of the three men, Mr. Hill, Mr. Green, and Mr. Berry, rested upon his not spinning another time, for he had claimed to hold guard for them and two others whilst they strangled the knight and ran him through with his own sword. When Prance denied his part the second time, he was returned to Newgate, whether for the first lies or the next, and kept in the insufferable coffin cell they called the Little Ease, so that he may decide against his foolishness and speak another time for Oates. "Please, madam, do not ask me, for I dare not tell you. Everything I know is that I cannot more listen to this noise. Release me." He had already released himself from Mrs. Airy's grasp, so his request was to release him from our company. With clenched lips, my neck stiff with strain, I could barely nod. But with this, and another scream from yonder, he took his leave, running in the direction of Holborn faster than before, as if the devil himself were after his soul. Was there no let-up for that poor tortured man? If we had authority or courage, we could have stormed that cold, dark place and put an immediate end to his suffering. But none dared to do it. A few women were no match to the strength of men. But neither could we leave, even though the groans and screams and cries were unbearable. Somehow, by hearing those screams, we suffered with him. None of us considered leaving him to cry into the night alone. We could not turn our back on him, much as it would allay our own discomfort, for we were women of charity. We had taken it upon ourselves to alleviate pain and hardship of those wrongly imprisoned, and must stay dedicated to our cause. If we could not prevent pain, we must suffer with those that had it. Though he had perjured himself, Prance was one of those unfortunates. So we listened, trapped in that place, by conscience until 7 in the evening. The screams became more sinister once a dark night came upon us. Like a wounded or hungry animal, they were perpetual and soul-destroying. Paralysed by impotence and despair, those of us that dared uncover our ears could not help but cry for the man. Several times I had thought the groaning stopped and removed my hands, only to hear the fullness of the next tortured howl. My last meagre meal forced itself upwards, and I turned to the wall for support as I retched. Then, at 7 by the church bell, voices alerted us to men approaching along the street. 3 men walked past us without manners enough to either nod or raise their hat to the ladies that stood shivering by the wall, and turned into the lodge. By his dress, the shorter, more portly one was a minister. In the flickering orange light of his torch, his grey hair flashed orange, and the shadow of his face altered what might be the semblance of a man in daytime to unnatural sinner by night. Some of us peered through the gate and watched as they entered the hole. Shortly after, the noise stopped, and I could only thank God for the silence. I hoped the end had come, because he was no longer tortured and not because he had died. But I could not suppress the thought that if he died, then that would be a final end to his suffering, that they could do no more to hurt him. My teeth chattered noisily in the sudden quiet. My bones ached as only old bones knew how to, and I became aware that my old injuries were nagging me, and that I could not tarry much longer in the cold. Metal clashed against metal as the doors in the distance were locked and bolted for the night. The prisoners closed in. Occasionally a muffled shout or laugh or cry came from within, but mostly we were left to stand in the stillness. Then Harris pulled shut the big metal door into the lodge with a loud clang, making our cold bones clench in fright. We could watch no more. A key turned in the nearby lock, and Harris's footsteps quietened as he walked away on the other side. "There is naught more to be done here tonight," this said Mary. "I would gladly sit before a well-stoked fire now," said Mrs. Airy, through clacking teeth, "perhaps with a dish of broth to warm my hands and insides." "I too am ready to leave," I said, "but I am loath to leave without knowledge of what has occurred this day. Is there any willing to stay longer to discover something more?" Mrs. Airy wrapped her arms around her and said, "There is not use to it. We should take our homes now." "It is unlikely this night will reveal more, Mrs. Cellier," said the youngster. "I will come back first thing in the morning and see if I can discover more then." As their elder, they again looked to me for guidance, and I suggested we take turns to watch the place when we could. The silence was eerie after the screams. It was as if they had torn open the air, filled it with violence, and filled my whole body with such torment it reverberated deep inside me. The likes of that noise I never wished to hear again. But in that I held false hope, for it followed me home through the streets, and whenever I became complacent against it, woke me in the night many years ever after. Did Prance die, or did he merely have respite from a fate worse than death? For that answer I would have to wait, for there was no answer here tonight.